A collections agency called me on a Tuesday morning to discuss my outstanding business loan. And I remember laughing, genuinely confused, telling the representative she must have the wrong person because I didn't own a business and had never taken out a loan of that size in my life. She read back my name, my social security number, and a loan amount of $211,000, all correct. My best friend of over a decade had defaulted on a business loan I'd co-signed 4 years earlier, and then simply vanished, leaving me legally responsible for the entire remaining balance. My name is Jordan, and this is the story of how the single most trusting decision I ever made for a friend became the financial catastrophe that nearly destroyed my adult life, and the 2 years it took me to understand exactly how deliberately I'd been used. I want to explain how Marcus and I became close enough that co-signing a loan of this magnitude felt like a reasonable, uncomplicated decision at the time, because I think understanding the depth of that friendship matters to understanding just how devastating this betrayal ultimately became. Marcus and I met in our early 20s, working the same entry-level job at a logistics company, and became close friends almost immediately, the kind of friendship that survived job changes, relationship breakups, and eventually, in my case, marriage and the early years of parenthood. I remember, specifically, Marcus being the first person I called when my daughter was born, arriving at the hospital within an hour despite it being nearly midnight on a work night. I remember countless weekends spent helping him move apartments, celebrating his own relationship milestones, the accumulated texture of over a decade of genuine, mutual support that made him feel less like an ordinary friend and more like a permanent fixture in my understanding of my own life. Marcus had always been entrepreneurial, cycling through several small business ideas over the years I knew him, most of which never fully materialized beyond initial planning stages. 4 years ago, he came to me with what felt, at the time, like a genuinely well-researched opportunity, a specialty food distribution business, supplying regional restaurants with imported ingredients through relationships he'd built during a previous job in the restaurant industry. He'd done real market research, had letters of intent from several restaurants already interested in becoming clients, and presented a business plan detailed enough that I remember being genuinely impressed by how much thought he'd put into it. The problem, as Marcus explained it, was that his personal credit history, damaged by some financial struggles during his mid-20s, made securing a business loan on his own essentially impossible, at least not at a reasonable interest rate. He asked me, given my stronger credit history and more stable financial position, if I'd be willing to co-sign the loan, framing it as a low-risk formality given how solid the business plan appeared. I want to be honest about my own decision-making process during this period, because I think it matters to understanding how someone can end up in this kind of devastating situation despite genuinely reasonable caution. I didn't agree immediately. I asked for time to review the business plan myself, consulted briefly with an accountant friend who reviewed the projected numbers and found them plausible, if optimistic, and had multiple detailed conversations with Marcus about the specific risks involved in co-signing, including explicitly asking what would happen to my own financial obligation if the business ultimately failed. Marcus was, throughout these conversations, reassuring in a way that felt genuine rather than dismissive. He acknowledged the risk directly, told me he understood if I said no, and specifically committed, multiple times, to keeping me fully informed about the business's performance, promising that if things ever started going wrong, he'd tell me immediately rather than letting me discover problems only once they become unmanageable. I ultimately agreed to co-sign the loan, a decision that, even now, I don't consider to have been reckless or naive given the information available to me at the time. I want to emphasize this specifically because I think it's important to understand that this wasn't a story of someone ignoring obvious warning signs. The warning signs, as I would eventually learn, were deliberately kept from me for years. The business, Marcus's specialty food distribution company, operated for roughly 2.5 years with what appeared, from the updates Marcus provided, to be reasonable, if modest, success. He'd send me periodic updates, new client relationships, revenue figures that, while never spectacular, suggested steady, sustainable operation. I want to describe the specific texture of these updates, because I think it matters to understanding how genuinely convincing the false picture Marcus constructed actually was. They weren't vague reassurances. They included specific numbers, occasional photos of product shipments, details about particular restaurant clients that made the entire narrative feel concrete and verifiable, even though I never actually independently verified any of it beyond trusting Marcus's own reporting. I want to describe the first small sign that something might be wrong, though I didn't recognize its full significance at the time. Roughly 2 years into the loan term, Marcus mentioned, during what I remember as an otherwise casual conversation, that the business had experienced some cash flow timing issues related to a large client payment that had been delayed, but assured me this was a normal, manageable part of running a distribution business with net 30 payment terms, nothing that threatened the loan payments themselves. I didn't push for additional detail at the time, trusting, as I had throughout our entire friendship, that Marcus would tell me directly if something more serious was developing. This trust, I would eventually learn, was being systematically exploited during exactly this period, as the business's actual financial situation had already deteriorated considerably beyond what Marcus's casual explanation suggested. I received a call from the collections agency roughly 18 months after that conversation about cash flow timing issues, a call that revealed, all at once, that the business had actually defaulted on its loan payments nearly 14 months earlier, that Marcus had stopped making payments entirely without informing me, and that the lender, after exhausting collection efforts directed at Marcus, who had apparently become unreachable, was now pursuing me directly as the cosigner legally responsible for the outstanding balance. I want to try to describe the specific, vertiginous shock of that phone call, understanding that not only had the business failed considerably more catastrophically than I'd ever been told, but that Marcus had apparently been aware of this failure for over a year, continuing to avoid informing me despite his explicit, repeated promises to keep me updated if anything went wrong. I remember sitting at my kitchen table long after that call ended, my coffee going cold, staring at the notes I'd scrawled during the conversation. The loan number, the outstanding balance, the collections agency's callback information, trying to reconcile this devastating information against the calm, reassuring updates Marcus had continued providing throughout what I now understood had actually been over a year of concealed default. I called Marcus immediately after that devastating call, my hands shaking as I dialed a number I called countless times over more than a decade of friendship. The number was disconnected. I want to describe the specific, additional layer of devastation this discovery added, understanding that Marcus hadn't simply failed to update me about a business setback, but had apparently, deliberately made himself unreachable, understanding that the consequences of the business's failure were about to land squarely on me. I spent the following weeks attempting to track Marcus down through every channel I could think of, social media accounts that had gone silent, mutual friends who claimed not to have heard from him in months. His last known address, where a new tenant informed me he'd moved out abruptly nearly 4 months earlier without leaving any forwarding information. I want to describe the specific, exhausting process of understanding the full legal and financial reality of my situation, working with an attorney to determine exactly what my obligations actually were as co-signer, and what, if any, legal recourse might exist against Marcus for what increasingly appeared to be a deliberate, calculated abandonment of both the business and his explicit promises to me. My attorney, a careful, experienced man named Mr. Castillo who specialized in commercial lending disputes, reviewed the original loan documentation alongside the collections agency's records, delivering an assessment that confirmed my worst fears regarding my own legal exposure. As co-signer, you're legally responsible for the full outstanding balance, regardless of Marcus's whereabouts or his failure to inform you about the default, he explained during our initial consultation. The lender isn't required to pursue him specifically before coming after you. They can choose whichever party is easier to actually collect from. And given that Marcus appears to have disappeared, that's going to be you. I want to describe what it felt like, receiving this legal assessment, understanding that regardless of Marcus's deception and abandonment, I remained fully, legally responsible for a debt that had grown, through months of accumulated interest and penalties during the period Marcus stopped making payments without informing me, to just over $211,000. I want to describe the specific, exhausting months that followed, navigating both the practical financial catastrophe of this debt alongside the deeper, more painful process of trying to understand how a friendship I'd trusted for over a decade could have resulted in this level of calculated abandonment. I hired a private investigator, a decision that felt genuinely surreal given how far this situation had already extended beyond anything I'd ever anticipated needing to navigate, specifically to help locate Marcus and understand the actual timeline of what had happened to the business. The investigator, a methodical woman named Detective Reyes who had transitioned into private work after years handling financial fraud cases, spent nearly 6 weeks compiling a picture of Marcus's actual activities during the period he'd been telling me the business was experiencing only minor cash flow timing issues. What she discovered painted a considerably more devastating picture than I'd initially understood. The business had, according to financial records Detective Reyes was able to access through the bankruptcy filing Marcus had apparently initiated for the company itself, without informing me, actually begun failing considerably earlier than that vague conversation about payment delays had suggested, nearly 2 years into the loan term. roughly 6 months before Marcus first mentioned any issues to me at all. I want to describe the specific, sickening details Detective Reyes uncovered regarding how Marcus had actually managed the business's decline. Rather than the ordinary, if unfortunate, business failure I might have understood and processed with some measure of equanimity, the records suggested a pattern of increasingly desperate, poor decision-making, taking on additional short-term debt at predatory interest rates to cover the widening gap between revenue and expenses, making increasingly risky inventory purchases based on optimistic projections that never materialized, essentially digging the business into a considerably deeper hole over many months while continuing to tell me everything remained fundamentally stable. I want to describe learning, through Detective Reyes's investigation, that Marcus had actually relocated to a different state roughly 5 months before that devastating collections call, apparently taking a new job under circumstances that suggested a deliberate, calculated decision to simply walk away from both the failed business and the loan obligation, understanding that as co-signer, I would ultimately absorb the consequences he was actively avoiding. I want to describe the specific, difficult decision I faced once Detective Reyes located Marcus's actual current location and employment, understanding that I now had the practical information necessary to pursue legal action against him directly, seeking to hold him accountable for the specific breach of trust involved in both his deliberate financial mismanagement and his explicit abandonment of the promises he'd made when initially asking me to co-sign. I consulted extensively with Mr. Castillo about the viability of pursuing Marcus directly for reimbursement, a legal process he explained would likely prove both expensive and only partially successful even in the best-case scenario. Given Marcus's apparent lack of substantial assets and the genuine difficulty of collecting judgments against individuals who have demonstrated willingness to relocate and avoid contact specifically to escape financial obligations, I ultimately decided to pursue legal action against Marcus anyway, understanding that even a partial recovery, combined with the accountability of a formal legal judgment establishing his responsibility for what had happened, felt important beyond simply the financial calculation involved. I want to describe the specific, exhausting legal process that followed, involving formal service of legal papers to Marcus's new address, a process that required additional investigative work given his apparent continued efforts to avoid direct contact, followed by several months of legal proceedings that Marcus, notably, never personally appeared for, allowing his absence to result in a default judgment in my favor. I want to be honest that this legal victory, while providing some measure of formal accountability, didn't meaningfully resolve my actual financial crisis. Marcus's continued absence and apparent lack of substantial, garnishable assets meant that even with a legal judgment in my favor, actual collection proved genuinely difficult, netting only a small fraction of the total debt over the following year through wage garnishment once Detective Reyes's continued investigation confirmed his current employment. I want to describe the specific, exhausting process of managing the actual debt itself during this same period, working with the lender to establish a modified payment plan that wouldn't completely devastate my own family's financial stability, a negotiation that required extensive documentation of my own financial circumstances and Marcus's abandonment, ultimately resulting in a restructured payment arrangement extending over 8 years, considerably longer than the original loan term, but manageable enough to avoid the more catastrophic consequences bankruptcy on my own and might have otherwise required. I want to describe the specific, difficult conversations I had with my wife, Elena, throughout this entire crisis, understanding that my decision to co-sign this loan 4 years earlier now directly, significantly affected our shared family finances and future planning, a burden she hadn't chosen but now needed to navigate alongside me regardless. I need you to know I don't blame you for this, Elena told me, during one particularly difficult evening early in this crisis, when I was struggling with genuine guilt about the impact this situation was having on our family. You made a reasonable decision based on the information you had at the time, for a friend you trusted for over a decade. This isn't your failure. This is Marcus's choice to deceive and abandon you, and I'm not going to let you carry guilt that actually belongs to him. I want to describe how profoundly important this specific support from Elena proved throughout the following years, understanding that navigating this level of financial devastation, while also processing genuine guilt about my own role in the original decision, could have significantly damaged our marriage, had she responded with anything less than the clear-eyed, supportive perspective she consistently maintained throughout this entire ordeal. I want to describe the specific, ongoing complexity of processing this particular betrayal, understanding that unlike some forms of financial harm, this situation involved someone I'd genuinely, deeply trusted for over a decade, someone whose friendship had felt, right up until that devastating collections call, like one of the more stable, reliable relationships of my entire adult life. I've spent considerable time in therapy since this all happened, specifically working through both the practical trauma of the financial devastation and the deeper question of how to process trusting someone this completely, only to discover that trust had been so calculatedly exploited during a period when Marcus was apparently making increasingly desperate, poor decisions rather than honoring his explicit promise to keep me informed. I want to describe the specific, difficult process of eventually confronting the reality that I would likely never fully understand Marcus's own internal reasoning throughout this entire situation. Whether his initial business plan and promises had been genuinely sincere before circumstances spiraled beyond his control, or whether some element of calculated exploitation had existed from the very beginning. Understanding that I would probably never have the opportunity for the kind of direct, honest conversation that might have provided genuine closure regarding these unanswered questions. It's been just over 2 years since that initial devastating phone call from the collections agency. I've continued making payments on the restructured loan, now roughly 3 years into the 8-year repayment plan, watching the outstanding balance slowly, steadily decrease, even while understanding I'll likely be managing this financial obligation for several more years before it's fully resolved. I've since developed what I consider a considerably more cautious approach to any future financial entanglement with friends or family, understanding, in a way I genuinely didn't before this experience, how quickly even a carefully considered decision, made with reasonable diligence and explicit safeguards, can become a devastating, long-term burden when the other party involved ultimately chooses deception and abandonment over honesty and accountability. I think, often, about the specific cruelty of learning, through Detective Reyes's investigation, that Marcus had actually known about the business's serious decline for many months before he ever mentioned anything to me. Understanding that every conversation we had during that period, every casual update about manageable cash flow timing issues, represented a deliberate choice to continue deceiving me rather than honoring the explicit promise that had originally convinced me to take on this significant financial risk on his behalf. If you've ever extended significant financial trust to someone close to you, only to discover that trust had been deliberately, calculatedly exploited over an extended period, I want to hear how you navigated both the practical financial recovery and the deeper process of processing that specific betrayal. I used to believe that a decade of genuine, tested friendship represented sufficient foundation for the kind of significant financial trust co-signing alone requires. I've learned, in the most devastating way possible, that even friendships built on years of genuine closeness can ultimately reveal themselves to be considerably less reliable than the years of shared history might suggest, and that sometimes the people we trust most completely are exactly the ones capable of the most devastating, sustained deception when their own circumstances become desperate enough.